You're nothing but a burden, Mom. Always interfering, always questioning my decisions. I'm running a multi-million-dollar company here, not some garage sale." Those words sliced through the air of the upscale Chicago steakhouse like a blade. My son Caleb's face, once filled with gratitude and respect, now showed nothing but cold contempt as he glared at me across the white tablecloth. The champagne we'd ordered to celebrate his tech company's latest acquisition suddenly tasted bitter. Before we dive deeper into this story, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. And if this resonates with you, make sure you hit that subscribe button because tomorrow we have something truly shocking planned for you. Little did Caleb know that calling me a burden would cost him everything. The 51% controlling stake in Wright Technologies that I'd quietly held for 3 years was about to remind him exactly who had the real power in his so-called empire. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The mahogany-paneled boardroom of Wright Technologies fell silent as my voice cut through the tension like a knife. As the majority shareholder holding 51% of this company, I'm calling for an immediate vote of no confidence in the current CEO. 23 faces turned toward me in shock, their expressions ranging from confusion to outright disbelief. But none looked more stunned than my son Caleb, whose mouth hung open as he processed what I'd just announced. "That's impossible," he stammered, his usual commanding presence crumbling before the assembled board members and department heads. "You can't, you don't." His voice trailed off as the weight of reality began to settle in. For 3 years, he'd believed he was building his empire, making decisions with the confidence of someone who thought he held all the cards. He was about to learn just how wrong he'd been. The irony wasn't lost on me as I watched his face cycle through emotions: confusion, denial, anger, and finally, the dawning realization that everything he thought he knew about his company was a carefully constructed illusion. Just 48 hours earlier, in that expensive steakhouse, he'd called me a burden. He'd dismissed my concerns, my experience, my very presence in his life as nothing more than unwanted interference. Now, surrounded by his colleagues and employees, he was discovering that his burden of a mother was actually the puppet master who'd been pulling the strings all along. "Frederick," I said, addressing the company's chief financial officer, Frederick Scott, who sat frozen in his leather chair. "Please distribute the shareholder documentation to everyone present. I think it's time we cleared up any confusion about the ownership structure of this company." Frederick's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the manila folder in front of him. He'd known the truth, of course. As CFO, he'd been one of the few people privy to the real ownership structure, bound by confidentiality agreements that had kept him silent even as Caleb made increasingly reckless decisions. The rustle of papers filled the boardroom as each person received their copy of the shareholder registry. I watched their faces as they processed the information, some more quickly than others. Jade Russell, the head of human resources, was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Wright, this shows you've held controlling interest since the company's incorporation. But Caleb has been making all the strategic decisions." "Because I allowed him to," I replied, my voice steady despite the emotional turmoil churning beneath the surface. "I believed in giving him the opportunity to prove himself as a leader, to build something meaningful with the foundation we'd established together. Unfortunately, recent events have shown me that my faith was misplaced." Caleb finally found his voice, though it cracked with a mixture of desperation and fury. "You can't do this to me. I built this company from nothing. Every client, every contract, every innovation, that was me, not you." The assembled executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly caught between loyalty to the CEO they'd been following and the shocking revelation of where their real power lay. "You built it from nothing?" I asked, my eyebrows raising slightly. "That's an interesting perspective. considering the initial seed funding of $2.3 million came from my personal investment portfolio. The office lease that gave you credibility with early clients, secured with my personal guarantee, the equipment, the first round of hiring, the marketing budget that got Wright Technologies its first major contracts, all funded by me while you focused on the technical aspects you genuinely excelled at. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see several board members exchanging glances, pieces of a puzzle they'd never fully understood beginning to fall into place. Ronald, Wright, no relation despite sharing our surname, served as the head of business development. He cleared his throat nervously before speaking. Mrs. Wright, if I may ask, why reveal this now? What's changed? It was a fair question, and one that deserved an honest answer. I took a moment to gather my thoughts, aware that every word I spoke would likely be remembered and repeated long after this meeting ended. What's changed, Ronald, is that I've come to realize that enabling someone's success while allowing them to believe they achieved it entirely through their own efforts doesn't create gratitude or humility. It creates entitlement and arrogance. Paused, letting my words sink in before continuing. Over the past year, I've watched my son make increasingly poor decisions, treat employees with disrespect, and pursue strategies that prioritize his ego over the company's long-term health. When I attempted to voice concerns or offer guidance based on my 40 years of business experience, I was told I was being a burden, that my input wasn't wanted or needed. Caleb's face had gone from pale to flushed, a combination of embarrassment and rage coloring his features. So this is what, revenge? You're going to destroy everything I've worked for because I hurt your feelings at dinner? This isn't about hurt feelings, Caleb, I replied, though the memory of his words still stung. This is about protecting an investment and ensuring the continued success of a company that employs 127 people and serves clients who depend on our services. When the person making decisions consistently demonstrates poor judgment and an inability to accept feedback, change becomes necessary. The tension in the room was palpable as everyone processed what they were witnessing. A family drama playing out in the corporate arena, with millions of dollars and dozens of jobs hanging in the balance. I could see the calculations happening, behind various sets of eyes as executives considered their own positions and loyalties in this new reality. The vote I'm calling for is simple, I continued, maintaining eye contact with each board member as I spoke. Do we have confidence in Caleb Wright's continued leadership as CEO of Wright Technologies? Or do we believe a change in leadership is necessary for the company's future success? I reached into my briefcase and withdrew a stack of printed ballots, each one bearing the official company letterhead and legal language that made this more than just a symbolic gesture. You're out of your mind if you think they'll vote against me, Caleb said, but his bravado couldn't quite mask the uncertainty creeping into his voice. These people work with me every day. They know what I've accomplished, what I'm capable of. They do indeed, I agreed, which is exactly why I'm confident in allowing them to make this decision democratically. If your leadership has been as exemplary as you believe, then you have nothing to worry about. The vote will reflect that confidence, and we can move forward with a clear understanding of where everyone stands. As Frederick began distributing the ballots, I caught sight of Caleb's expression and felt a pang of something that might have been regret. This wasn't how I'd ever imagined things would unfold between us. When I'd first invested in his vision, 3 years ago, I'd dreamed of watching him succeed, of being the proud mother whose quiet support had helped her son build something remarkable. Instead, I was sitting in a boardroom, using corporate machinations to teach him a lesson about respect and humility that should have been learned decades earlier. But as I looked around the room at the faces of the employees whose livelihoods depended on the decisions made in this building, I knew I was doing the right thing. Sometimes being a good mother meant making the hard choices, even when they broke your heart. My name is Amara Wright, and for 35 years, I built my reputation in the unforgiving world of venture capital and corporate finance in downtown Chicago. Starting as a junior analyst at Peterson & Associates straight out of Northwestern University, I clawed my way up through an industry that didn't exactly welcome women with open arms in the 1980s. By the time I reached my 40s, I was managing a portfolio worth over $500 million and had earned a reputation for spotting promising startups before anyone else even knew they existed. The corner office on the 42nd floor of the Willis Tower wasn't just a workspace. It was a testament to decades of 16-hour days, missed family dinners, and the kind of strategic thinking that turned small investments into massive returns. I'd helped launch companies that went on to become household names, guided entrepreneurs through IPOs that made them millionaires overnight, and developed an instinct for business that my colleagues often described as uncanny. But none of that professional success compared to the pride I felt watching my son Caleb grow up. Even as a young boy, he'd shown a remarkable aptitude for technology that went far beyond typical curiosity. While other kids his age were playing video games, Caleb was taking apart computers to understand how they worked, teaching himself programming languages, and dreaming up solutions to problems that most adults couldn't even identify. His father, George Wright, had been a brilliant software engineer at IBM before a heart attack took him from us when Caleb was just 15. Those were dark days for both of us, losing the man who'd been the stabilizing force in our family while trying to navigate Caleb's teenage years and my demanding career. But George's death also brought Caleb and me closer together in ways I hadn't expected. He threw himself into his studies with renewed intensity, as if channeling his grief into academic achievement, while I made the conscious decision to step back from some of my more time-consuming projects to be more present for him. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The investment principles I'd learned in the corporate world became the foundation for how I approached parenting a grieving teenager. I believed in Caleb's potential, the same way I believed in promising startups, not blindly, but based on evidence, track record, and careful analysis of character. When he won the state science fair with an innovative algorithm for data compression, I saw echoes of his father's brilliance. When he turned down multiple scholarship offers to attend MIT specifically because their computer science program would let him pursue his own research projects, I recognized the kind of strategic thinking that separated good entrepreneurs from great ones. During his college years, Caleb would call me almost weekly, not just to catch up, but to bounce ideas off someone he trusted. He'd describe his coursework, his side projects, his theories about where technology was heading. I found myself looking forward to those conversations more than almost anything else in my week. Here was this brilliant young man who valued my opinion, who sought my advice, who treated me as both his mother and a respected business mentor. After graduation, Caleb worked for 3 different tech companies over the course of 4 years, each position teaching him different aspects of the industry. He started as a junior developer at a gaming company, moved on to a mid-level position at a data analytics firm, and finally landed a senior role at a cybersecurity startup. But throughout those years, he kept talking about his own vision, a company that would bridge the gap between enterprise software and user-friendly design, making powerful business tools accessible to smaller companies that couldn't afford custom development. The idea wasn't just technically sound, it was personally meaningful to him. He'd watched his father struggle with clunky, expensive software solutions at IBM, and he'd seen how small businesses in our neighborhood were being left behind by the digital revolution simply because they couldn't afford the tools that larger companies took for granted. His proposed solution combined sophisticated back-end architecture with intuitive interfaces that would require minimal training to use effectively. When Caleb first approached me about investing in Wright Technologies, I wasn't thinking like a mother trying to help her son achieve his dreams. I was thinking like a venture capitalist, evaluating a business opportunity. I spent weeks reviewing his business plan, analyzing the market research he'd conducted, and interviewing potential customers to understand their pain points. The numbers were compelling, the technology was innovative, and the management team, Caleb plus 2 colleagues from his previous companies, had the right combination of technical skills and business acumen. But there was something else that made this investment different from any other I'd made in my career. This wasn't just about financial returns or portfolio diversification. This was about believing in someone whose potential I'd been watching develop for over 2 decades. I'd seen Caleb's work ethic during those late nights studying after his father's death. I'd witnessed his integrity when he'd turned down a lucrative job offer because the company's business practices didn't align with his values. I'd watched him mentor younger developers at every company he'd worked for, showing the kind of leadership qualities that couldn't be taught in business school. So when I wrote that initial check for $2.3 million, I was making both a business decision and a personal one. The business decision was based on solid fundamentals, market opportunity, competitive advantage, experienced team, scalable technology. The personal decision was based on 3 decades of watching my son become the kind of man his father would have been proud of. The legal structure we established was my idea, though I presented it to Caleb as standard venture capital practice. By holding 51% of the company's equity, I protected my investment while still giving him significant ownership and complete operational control. It was a common arrangement in the startup world. Investors maintain voting control, while founders run the day-to-day operations. The structure allowed Caleb to make decisions quickly without needing board approval for routine matters, while ensuring that any major strategic changes would require my consent. At the time, Caleb seemed grateful for both the financial support and the hands-off approach I'd promised to take. "I want to prove I can do this on my own merits," he'd told me over dinner the night we signed the incorporation papers. "Having you as an investor gives me credibility with other potential partners, but I need to know that any success we achieve is because of the work we put in, not because my mom pulled strings behind the scenes." I'd respected that desire for independence, perhaps more than I should have. Over the following 3 years, I'd watched Wright Technologies grow from a 3-person startup working out of a shared office space to a 127-employee company with clients across the Midwest. I'd attended board meetings when legally required, provided guidance when specifically asked, and celebrated milestones from what I thought was an appropriate distance. But somewhere along the way, that appropriate distance had become a chasm. The son who used to call me for advice had stopped seeking my input on anything beyond the most routine corporate formalities. The young man who'd once valued my business expertise had apparently decided that my opinions were no longer worth hearing. And the company I'd helped create had become a source of tension between us, rather than the collaboration I'd originally envisioned. The phone call that changed everything came on a rainy Tuesday evening in October, 3 years ago. I was reviewing quarterly reports in my home office, the familiar ritual of analyzing numbers and projections that had become second nature after decades in venture capital. When Caleb's name appeared on my phone screen, I felt the same little flutter of anticipation that I always experienced when he called. Would tonight be one of those conversations where we talked for hours about technology trends and business strategy, like we used to do when he was in college? "Mom, do you have a few minutes?" His voice carried an excitement that I hadn't heard since his graduation day. "I know it's late, but I've been working on something, and I think I'm ready to take the next step." I closed my laptop and gave him my full attention. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" What followed was a 45-minute presentation that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with venture capital in the first place. Caleb laid out his vision for Wright Technologies with the kind of passionate precision that separated dreamers from doers. He'd identified a genuine market gap, small and medium-sized businesses that needed sophisticated software solutions but couldn't afford the enterprise-level tools that larger companies used. His proposed platform would democratize access to powerful business analytics, customer relationship management, and workflow automation tools by packaging them in an intuitive, affordable interface. "The technology exists," he explained, his voice gaining momentum as he warmed to his topic. But it's scattered across different vendors, requires extensive training to implement, and costs more than most smaller companies can justify. What? If we could create a unified platform that combines the best features of these separate tools, simplifies the user experience, and prices it at a point that makes sense for businesses with 50 employees instead of 5,000? The business case was compelling, but what really caught my attention was the research he'd already conducted. Caleb had spent months interviewing potential customers, analyzing competitor offerings, and developing detailed financial projections. He'd identified specific pain points that existing solutions didn't address, mapped out a development timeline that was ambitious but realistic, and even secured preliminary interest from several potential clients. I've been talking to David Chen and Aliyah Cooper, he continued, referring to two colleagues from his previous companies. David would handle the back-end architecture and data security, while Aliyah would lead user experience design and customer onboarding. We've been working on a prototype during evenings and weekends for the past 6 months. The fact that he'd already assembled a team and begun development work spoke to his seriousness about the venture, but it also raised questions about timing and capital requirements. What kind of funding are you looking for? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Caleb took a deep breath before responding. We need $2.3 million to get through the first 18 months. Product development, initial hiring, office space, marketing, and enough runway to prove our concept before seeking additional investment rounds. It was a substantial amount, but not unreasonable for a technology startup with the scope he was describing. I'd seen companies with less impressive business plans raise significantly more money from traditional venture capital firms. But those companies hadn't been founded by my son, and their success or failure wouldn't have personal implications beyond financial returns. Have you considered approaching other investors? I asked, trying to separate my maternal instincts from my professional judgment. I've thought about it, Caleb admitted. But honestly, Mom, I'd rather work with someone I trust, someone who understands both technology and business strategy. You've been doing this longer than almost anyone I know, and you've seen how good companies are built from the ground up. I know this puts you in an awkward position, being both my mother and my potential investor. But I think we can make it work if we establish clear boundaries. The vulnerability in his voice reminded me of conversations we'd had during his teenage years, when he'd wrestle with difficult decisions and ultimately seek my guidance. But this wasn't about choosing colleges or career paths. This was about trusting him with a significant portion of my personal wealth based on his belief that he could build something meaningful. Over the following 2 weeks, I approached Caleb's proposal with the same rigor I'd apply to any investment opportunity. I reviewed his business plan line by line, challenged his assumptions about market size and customer acquisition costs, and conducted my own interviews with potential users to validate his research. I consulted with technology experts in my network to assess the technical feasibility of his proposed platform, and I analyzed the competitive landscape to understand how Wright Technologies would differentiate itself. The due diligence process revealed both strengths and potential concerns. On the positive side, Caleb's technical vision was sound, his market research was thorough, and his team had the right combination of skills to execute on their plans. The financial projections were conservative enough to be credible while still showing the kind of growth potential that could generate significant returns. But there were risks beyond the typical startup challenges. The technology sector was notoriously volatile, with new competitors emerging constantly and customer preferences shifting rapidly. Building a platform that served multiple business functions effectively would require substantial ongoing development, resources, and perhaps most concerning from a personal perspective, mixing family relationships with business partnerships had destroyed more than one family I knew. During our second formal meeting, this one held in my office downtown, with Caleb presenting to me as he would to any potential investor, I asked the question that had been weighing on my mind since his initial call. "What happens if this doesn't work out the way we hope?" I asked. "Not just financially, but personally. How do we protect our relationship if the business struggles, or if we disagree about strategic direction?" Caleb had clearly anticipated this. Concern. "I've thought about that a lot," he said. "I think the key is establishing clear roles and expectations from the beginning. You would be an investor and board member, but I would be responsible for day-to-day operations and strategic decisions. If we disagree about something significant, we'd handle it the same way any professional board would, through discussion, analysis, and ultimately a vote. And if those votes don't go your way, then I'd have to trust that your judgment is based on protecting the company's interests, not on being my mother," he replied. "That's the risk I'm willing to take because I believe in this vision enough to bet my career on it." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, but I still had one more crucial question. "Why is this important to you, Caleb? Beyond the potential, financial rewards, what drives your passion for this particular opportunity?" His answer revealed the depth of thought he'd put into this decision. "Because I remember watching Dad struggle with software at IBM that was powerful, but incredibly frustrating to use. I remember you telling me about small business owners who couldn't compete with larger companies because they couldn't afford the tools they needed. This platform could level that playing field in a way that actually matters to people's lives and livelihoods." That evening, I called my financial advisor and began the process of liquidating the investments necessary to fund Wright Technologies. It wasn't just a business decision, though the fundamentals certainly supported it. It was a vote of confidence in my son's vision, his character, and his ability to build something that would honor his father's memory while creating value for customers who needed better solutions. 3 days later, we signed the incorporation, papers that established Wright Technologies as a Delaware C corporation, with Caleb holding 35% equity, his partners David and Aliyah each holding 7%, and me holding the remaining 51% as the founding investor. The ownership structure gave me voting control while providing meaningful equity stakes for the founding team. As we walked out of the lawyer's office that afternoon, Caleb turned to me with an expression that mixed gratitude with determination. "Thank you for believing in this, Mom. I won't let you down." Looking back now, I realize that was the last time he would express genuine appreciation for my support without qualification or resentment. Within 6 months, my investment would become something he seemed to take for granted, and my involvement would transform from welcomed partnership to unwanted interference. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Like watching someone you love develop a serious illness, the changes in Caleb's attitude toward me were gradual enough that I could rationalize each incident as an isolated occurrence rather than part of a troubling pattern. The first sign came during our third quarterly board meeting, about 9 months after Wright Technologies had officially launched. The company had secured its first major client, a regional restaurant chain that needed integrated point of sale and inventory management solutions, and Caleb was riding high on the success. As he presented the quarterly numbers to our small board, which consisted of myself, Frederick Scott as our CFO, and an independent director we'd recruited from the technology sector, his confidence was palpable. Revenue is up 340% from last quarter, and we're tracking ahead of our customer acquisition projections, Caleb announced, clicking through his PowerPoint presentation with obvious pride. Based on current trends, we should hit our 18-month revenue target 6 months early. It was genuinely impressive progress, and I felt the same surge of maternal pride that I'd experienced watching him excel in school. But as a venture capitalist, I'd learned that early success could be just as dangerous as early struggles if it led to overconfidence or premature scaling. "That's excellent news," I said when he finished his presentation. "What's driving the acceleration? Are we seeing organic growth from referrals, or is this primarily from the marketing campaigns we discussed?" Caleb's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a brief flash of irritation crossing his features before he composed himself. "It's a combination of factors, Mom. The restaurant chain has been very satisfied with our platform, and word of mouth in that industry is strong. Plus, Aaliyah's user experience improvements have significantly reduced our customer onboarding time. Have we conducted any formal customer satisfaction surveys? I pressed gently. And what's our churn rate looking like now that we have enough data to analyze retention patterns? This time, the irritation was more visible. We're monitoring all the relevant metrics, Caleb replied, his tone slightly sharper than usual. I can have Aaliyah prepare a detailed retention analysis for next quarter's meeting if that would be helpful. Frederick shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly sensing the tension. Our independent director, Lemuel Kelly, jumped in to redirect the conversation toward technical development milestones. But the seed of discord had been planted. After the meeting, as we gathered our papers and prepared to leave, Caleb approached me. "Mom, can I talk to you for a minute?" His voice carried a careful neutrality that put me on guard. "Of course," I replied, waiting as Frederick and Lemuel made their exits. Once we were alone in the small conference room, Caleb leaned against the table and crossed his arms. "I appreciate your engagement with the company, but some of your questions in there felt more like interrogation than board oversight." I was taken aback by his characterization. "Caleb, those were standard questions that any investor would ask. Customer satisfaction and retention metrics are fundamental to understanding business health." "I understand that," he said, though his body language suggested otherwise. "But when you ask them in front of Frederick and Lemuel, it feels like you're undermining my credibility as CEO. They need to see me as their leader, not as someone whose mother is constantly checking his homework." The analogy stung, partly because I could see how my questions might have appeared from his perspective. But it also revealed a fundamental misunderstanding about board governance that concerned me. "Board meetings are supposed to involve tough questions," I explained. "That's how we ensure the company is making sound decisions. If anything, other board members expect me to ask harder questions than external investors would, because I have the most to lose." Caleb nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. "I just think we need to be mindful of maintaining appropriate boundaries between your role as my mother and your role as an investor." That conversation set the tone for our interactions over the following year. Caleb began presenting information in ways that anticipated and deflected potential questions, providing exhaustive detail on metrics that painted the company favorably while glossing over areas that might raise concerns. Board meetings became performances rather than genuine strategic discussions, with Caleb clearly viewing my participation as a necessary annoyance rather than a valuable contribution. The pattern extended beyond formal meetings, where he'd once called me regularly to discuss challenges and brainstorm solutions. Our conversations became increasingly brief and superficial. When I'd ask about specific aspects of the business, he'd respond with phrases like, "We're handling it," or "It's under control," without providing the kind of detail that would allow me to offer meaningful input. More troubling was the way he began characterizing my involvement to others. During a company holiday party about 18 months into the venture, I overheard him talking to a group of employees about the challenges of working with investors. "The hardest part is managing expectations," he was saying. "Some investors want to be involved in every decision, even when they don't understand the day-to-day realities of running a tech company." The comment was clearly directed at me, though he was careful not to mention names. Several employees glanced in my direction, and I could see them processing the implication that their CEO was being micromanaged by an out-of-touch investor who happened to be his mother. The irony was that I'd been increasingly hands-off as the company appeared to stabilize and grow. Other than attending quarterly board meetings and reviewing financial statements, I'd deliberately avoided inserting myself into operational decisions. When Caleb wanted to hire additional developers, I'd supported the decision without question. When he'd proposed expanding into a larger office space, I'd enthusiastically endorsed the move. When he'd suggested bringing on a dedicated sales director, I'd helped him refine the job description and compensation package. But apparently, even that level of involvement was too much. During our final quarterly meeting of Wright Technologies, second year, the tension that had been building finally erupted into something closer to open conflict. Caleb was presenting plans for a significant expansion that would require additional funding, either through a new investment round or by reinvesting all profits back into growth initiatives. I'm recommending that we pursue aggressive expansion over the next 12 months, he announced, outlining plans to double the workforce, launch 2 new product modules, and expand into 3 additional markets. The opportunity cost of growing slowly is too high in this competitive environment. As I reviewed the financial projections he'd prepared, several things jumped out that concerned me. The expansion plans assumed customer acquisition costs would remain constant even as they moved into new markets where they had no established reputation. The revenue projections required not just maintaining their current growth rate, but accelerating it significantly. And most concerning, the plan allocated substantial resources to product features that seemed designed to compete with much larger, well-funded competitors rather than focusing on the small business niche where Wright Technologies had found initial success. This is quite ambitious, I said carefully. Have we validated demand for these new features with our existing customer base? And what's our contingency plan if acquisition costs in new markets turn out to be higher than projected? The familiar flash of irritation crossed Caleb's face, but this time he didn't try to hide it. Mom, with all due respect, I think you're being overly conservative. Every successful tech company goes through rapid expansion phases. If we don't seize this opportunity, our competitors will. Which competitors specifically? I asked. Because my understanding was that our competitive advantage came from serving smaller businesses that larger companies ignore. The market is evolving, Caleb replied, his tone becoming more defensive. If we don't evolve with it, we'll get left behind. Frederick and Lemuel exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. But I couldn't. Let concerns about family dynamics override my fiduciary responsibility as the majority shareholder. I'm not opposed to growth, I clarified, but I need to understand the strategic reasoning behind these specific initiatives. What data supports the assumption that our current customers want these additional features? And why are we confident that we can compete effectively against established players in the enterprise market? That's when Caleb made the comment that marked a point of no return in our professional relationship. Maybe the problem is that you're thinking like a traditional investor instead of understanding how disruptive technology actually works. The implications of that statement hung in the air like a challenge. He wasn't just disagreeing with my assessment. He was dismissing my expertise entirely, suggesting that my decades of experience in venture capital were somehow irrelevant to evaluating his business strategy. I see, I replied, keeping my voice level despite the anger building inside me. Well, perhaps we should table this discussion until you can provide the additional analysis I've requested. We can reconvene next week once we have more data to review. As the meeting broke up, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in our relationship. Caleb no longer saw me as a partner or mentor whose input was valuable. Instead, I'd become an obstacle to his vision, someone whose questions and concerns were impediments to be managed rather than legitimate oversight from his largest investor. The pattern was now clear, and it was accelerating toward a confrontation that neither of us seemed able to avoid. The anonymous email arrived in my inbox on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after our contentious board meeting. The subject line read simply, "Concerns about Wright Technologies, from a friend." My first instinct was to delete it. Anonymous messages were usually either spam or attempts at manipulation. But something about the timing made me pause and open it instead. "Mrs. Wright, I know this isn't the appropriate way to communicate, but I'm not sure who else to turn to. I work at Wright Technologies and have been increasingly concerned about some decisions being made without board oversight. I don't want to cause problems for anyone, But I think you should know that several significant expenditures have been approved that weren't included in the quarterly reports. Please consider this a heads up from someone who cares about the company's future." The message was unsigned and provided no specific details, but it confirmed suspicions that had been growing in my mind for weeks. Since our expansion discussion, I'd requested monthly financial summaries instead of waiting for quarterly reports. The numbers Caleb provided showed steady growth and controlled spending, but something about them felt incomplete, too clean, too perfectly aligned with projections. I forwarded the email to Frederick Scott with a brief note asking if he had any concerns about our financial reporting processes. His response came within an hour, and it was more revealing than I'd expected. "Amara, I've been meaning to schedule a private conversation with you. There are some accounting issues we should discuss, but I'd prefer to do it in person rather than over email. Are you available for coffee this week?" We met at a small cafe in downtown Chicago, far from Wright Technologies' offices in the River, North District. Frederick looked uncomfortable as he stirred his coffee, clearly wrestling with competing loyalties between his professional obligations and his relationship with Caleb. "I want to be clear that I'm not making accusations," he began carefully. "But there have been some unusual accounting practices that I think you should be aware of as the majority shareholder. Over the next hour, Frederick outlined a pattern of financial decisions that painted a troubling picture. Caleb had been reclassifying certain expenditures in ways that made the company's cash flow appear healthier than it actually was. Marketing. Expenses were being capitalized as customer acquisition investments. Office renovation costs were being spread across multiple quarters to smooth out expense spikes. Most concerning, several large payments to consultants and contractors were being categorized as research and development expenses, even though Frederick couldn't identify any deliverables associated with the work. "I've asked Caleb for documentation on these R&D projects multiple times," Frederick explained. "He keeps telling me that David Chen is managing those relationships and that the work is too technical for traditional accounting oversight. But David seems surprised when I mention specific vendor payments, as if he's not aware of them. The implications were deeply unsettling. Either Caleb was deliberately obscuring how company money was being spent, or there were significant communication breakdowns within the organization that suggested poor management controls. Have you discussed this with David or Aliyah directly?" I asked. Frederick shook his head. "I haven't wanted to undermine Caleb's authority by going around him, but I'm concerned that our financial reports to you aren't telling the complete story." That afternoon, I called David Chen and invited him to lunch under the pretense of wanting to better understand the technical development roadmap. David was enthusiastic about the opportunity to discuss his work, and his openness about ongoing projects made Frederick's concerns even more alarming. "We're making great progress on the core platform stability," David told me as we shared appetizers at a downtown restaurant. "The architecture we built initially is scaling well, though we'll need to consider some infrastructure upgrades if we continue growing at this pace." "What about the consulting projects that Caleb mentioned?" I asked casually. "The specialized R&D work that's been categorized separately from your internal development?" David's expression shifted to confusion. "I'm not sure what you're referring to. We haven't been using external consultants for any technical work. Aliyah and I have been handling all the development internally, with help from the junior developers we hired last quarter." The conversation continued for another hour, but David's answers only deepened my concerns. According to him, the company's technical roadmap was focused entirely on incremental improvements to their existing platform, exactly the kind of conservative approach that made sense for a young company. There was no evidence of the ambitious expansion projects that would justify the consulting expenses Frederick had identified. That evening, I did something I'd never done before in our professional relationship. I conducted my own investigation into Wright Technologies' activities. Using my access to the company's bank statements as a board member, I began analyzing expenditure patterns in detail. What I found was a web of payments that didn't align with the business operations I understood to be occurring. Over the past 6 months, Wright Technologies had paid nearly $300,000 to a consulting firm called Strategic Innovation Partners for services that were vaguely described as market expansion research and competitive analysis. The payments were structured as monthly retainers rather than project-based fees, suggesting an ongoing relationship. But when I searched for information about Strategic Innovation Partners online, I found virtually nothing. No website, no professional profiles for employees, no case studies or client testimonials. Even more concerning were a series of payments to various vendors for what were described as client entertainment and business development expenses. Individual charges ranged from expensive dinners at high-end restaurants to weekend trips to Las Vegas and Miami, all supposedly related to customer acquisition efforts. But when I cross-referenced these dates with the customer contracts in our files, there was no obvious correlation between the entertainment expenses and new business relationships. The pattern reminded me of situations I'd encountered during my venture capital career, where entrepreneurs began treating investor money as their personal funds once initial success made them feel invincible. The rationalizations were always similar. Expensive dinners were necessary for client relationships. Luxury accommodations were required to maintain credibility with potential partners, and consultant fees were investments in strategic thinking that would pay off in the long term. But what made this situation particularly painful was the personal dimension. This wasn't just a case of an entrepreneur I'd invested in making poor financial decisions. This was my son, the young man I'd trusted with a significant portion of my wealth based on his character and integrity, apparently using that trust to fund a lifestyle that had nothing to do with building a successful business. The breaking point came when I discovered payments totaling $75,000 to a luxury car dealership in downtown Chicago. The transaction was categorized as executive transportation, equipment, and dated just 2 weeks after our contentious board meeting about expansion plans. When I drove past Wright Technologies' offices the next day, I saw a brand new BMW sedan in the parking space marked CEO. That car represented everything that was wrong with how Caleb had begun approaching the business. Instead of focusing on customer value and sustainable growth, he was spending investor money on status symbols that did nothing to advance the company's mission. Instead of maintaining the lean bootstrap mentality that had made Wright Technologies successful in its early days, he was acting like the CEO of a mature corporation with unlimited resources. But perhaps most troubling was the deception involved. The car purchase hadn't been mentioned in any board meetings or financial reports. Like the consulting fees and entertainment expenses, it was hidden within broader categories that made oversight difficult without detailed investigation. I realized that my anonymous emailer had been right to be concerned. There were indeed significant expenditures being made without board oversight, and the pattern suggested that this was intentional rather than accidental. Caleb wasn't just making questionable financial decisions. He was actively concealing those decisions from the very people who had the fiduciary responsibility to oversee them. The son I'd raised to value honesty and integrity had apparently decided that those principles were optional when they interfered with his vision of success. The young man who'd once called me for advice about every important decision was now making major financial choices without even informing me they were being considered. As I sat in my home office that night, staring at bank statements and vendor invoices spread across my desk, I realized that the confrontation I'd been dreading was no longer a possibility. It was inevitable. The question wasn't whether we would have a serious conversation about the direction of Wright Technologies and Caleb's leadership. The question was whether that conversation would lead to a resolution or a complete breakdown in our relationship. Either way, I couldn't continue to ignore what I was seeing. My fiduciary duty as an investor demanded action. But more importantly, my responsibility as a mother required me to address behavior that was destroying both my son's integrity and the company we'd built together. The decision to hire a forensic accountant wasn't one I made lightly. Patricia Meadows came highly recommended by my attorney, with 20 years of experience uncovering financial irregularities in corporate investigations. When I explained the situation during our initial consultation, the mysterious consulting, payments, the entertainment expenses, the luxury car purchase, her expression grew increasingly grave. "Mrs. Wright," she said, setting down her pen after taking detailed notes, "what you're describing follows a very familiar pattern. Often, when entrepreneurs experience early success, they begin to rationalize increasingly extravagant spending as business necessities. The concerning part is the apparent effort to hide these expenditures from board oversight. Patricia's investigation took 3 weeks and cost me $15,000 in professional fees, money well spent for the clarity it provided about just how far Caleb's financial misconduct extended. Her final report, delivered to me in a bound folder with exhibits and supporting documentation, read like an indictment of everything I thought I knew about my son's character. The Strategic Innovation Partners consulting firm that had received $300,000 turned out to be a shell company registered in Delaware with a single listed officer, Kinsley King, who also happened to be Caleb's girlfriend of 8 months. I had never heard her name mentioned in any of our family conversations, which meant he had been deliberately keeping that relationship secret. The consulting payments were structured to avoid triggering automatic board notifications, suggesting sophisticated planning to conceal the arrangement. Kinsley's background, according to Patricia's research, was in marketing and public relations, with no apparent expertise in technology or business strategy. Her previous employment had been with small PR agencies handling local restaurant and retail clients, hardly the kind of experience that would justify $50,000 monthly retainers for strategic consulting. The work products associated with these payments were minimal: a few PowerPoint presentations about market positioning, and some generic competitive analysis that could have been compiled from publicly available sources. But the consulting payments were just the beginning. Patricia's forensic analysis revealed a systematic pattern of expense manipulation that painted Wright Technologies' financial health in an artificially positive light. Caleb had been timing certain payments to fall in specific quarters, moving costs between categories to smooth out expense spikes, and most egregiously, booking personal expenses as business costs whenever possible. The entertainment and travel expenses were particularly damaging to examine in detail. What Caleb had categorized as client development activities were actually personal trips with Kinsley, expensive dinners with friends, and luxury experiences that had no legitimate business purpose. A $12,000 weekend in Napa Valley was justified as a strategic planning retreat, despite the only participants being Caleb and Kinsley. A $8,000 dinner at Alinea was supposedly a client entertainment expense, but Patricia's investigation found no evidence that any Wright Technologies customers were present. The BMW purchase was just one of several luxury acquisitions that had been creatively categorized as business expenses. Caleb had also purchased a $25,000 watch as executive presentation equipment, $15,000 worth of designer clothing as client-facing professional attire, and $8,000 in golf equipment for customer relationship activities. The total amount of personal spending disguised as business expenses exceeded $200,000 over the previous 10 months. Perhaps most disturbing was Patricia's discovery that Caleb had been providing misleading information to our independent auditors. When the accounting firm requested documentation for certain expenses during their annual review, Caleb had provided altered invoices and fabricated explanations that concealed the personal nature of many purchases. This wasn't just poor judgment about appropriate business expenses. It was deliberate fraud designed to deceive both investors and auditors. The report also revealed that Wright Technologies' actual financial performance was significantly worse than the reports I'd been receiving. When the disguised personal expenses were properly categorized and the artificially manipulated timing was corrected, the company was barely breaking, even rather than showing the healthy profits Caleb had been reporting. The aggressive expansion plans he'd proposed weren't just ill-advised, they were financially impossible given the company's true cash position. Armed with Patricia's findings, I scheduled a private meeting with Frederick Scott to share the results and discuss our options. Frederick's reaction was a mixture of shock and relief. Shock at the scope of the deception, but relief that his own suspicions had been validated. "I knew something was wrong," he said, reviewing the forensic report in my office. "But I had no idea it was this extensive. Amara, this puts the company in serious jeopardy. If word of this gets out, it could destroy our credibility with customers and make future funding impossible." "What are our legal obligations?" I asked. "Do we need to report this to authorities, or can we handle it internally?" Frederick was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing the implications of various courses of action. "As CFO, I have a responsibility to ensure accurate financial reporting. The fact that falsified documents were provided to our auditors means this goes beyond internal company issues. But as a practical matter, how we handle it depends on what outcome you're seeking." That was the question I'd been wrestling with since receiving Patricia's report. What did I want to achieve? Punishment for Caleb's betrayal of trust? Recovery of the misappropriated funds? Protection of Wright Technologies and its employees? Preservation of what remained of our family relationship? The truth was, I wanted all of those things, but they weren't necessarily compatible goals. Pursuing criminal charges might result in punishment and potentially some financial recovery, but it would almost certainly destroy the company and end any possibility of reconciliation with my son. Handling the situation privately might preserve family relationships and company stability, but it would essentially reward Caleb's misconduct and set a precedent that financial deception was acceptable as long as it stayed within the family. I need to confront him directly first, I decided. Before we make any decisions about external reporting or legal action, I want to give him the opportunity to explain himself and potentially make this right voluntarily. Frederick nodded, though his expression suggested he doubted that approach would be successful. "Just remember, Amara, that as majority shareholder, you have both the power and the responsibility to protect the company's interests. Sometimes that means making decisions that feel personally painful, but are necessary for the greater good." The meeting I arranged with Caleb was scheduled for the following Friday at 2 p.m. in Wright Technologies' main conference room. I didn't tell him the specific purpose, only that we needed to discuss some financial matters that had come to my attention. His response was characteristically dismissive. "Sure, Mom. Let's get this over with quickly, though. I have a busy afternoon." That attitude, the casual dismissal of my concerns as an inconvenience to be endured, crystallized something in my mind about how far our relationship had deteriorated. The young man who had once valued my input and sought my guidance now saw my involvement as nothing more than an obstacle to his agenda. As I prepared for what I knew would be one of the most difficult conversations of my life, I found myself thinking about the advice I'd given other investors over the years when they faced similar situations with portfolio companies. The decision to remove a founder or CEO was never easy, but it became necessary when leadership failures threatened the survival of the enterprise. The difference, of course, was that this wasn't just any portfolio company, and Caleb wasn't just any CEO. This was my son, the boy I'd raised, the young man whose dreams I'd funded based on my belief in his character and potential. But Patricia's report made it clear that the person sitting across from me in that conference room would no longer be the son I remembered. He would be someone who had chosen deception and self-interest over integrity and accountability. The confrontation I'd been dreading was about to become unavoidable, and I suspected that regardless of how it unfolded, our relationship would never be the same. But I also knew that protecting Wright Technologies and its employees required me to act on the evidence I'd uncovered, even if it meant shattering the last illusions I held about the man my son had become. The only question remaining was whether Caleb would choose accountability and redemption or double down on the deception that had brought us to this point. Based on his behavior over the past months, I had little reason for optimism, but I owed it to both of us to give him one final chance to do the right thing. The call came at 7:30 a.m. on the Wednesday before our scheduled Friday meeting. Caleb's voice had an unusual energy to it, an excitement that I hadn't heard in months. "Mom, I have incredible news. Can we move our meeting to tonight instead? I want to celebrate something with you, and I think you're going to be amazed by what Wright Technologies has accomplished." Something about his tone set off alarm bells in my mind. After weeks of dismissive responses to my questions and concerns, this sudden enthusiasm felt calculated, as if he was trying to manipulate the context of our conversation before I had a chance to present Patricia's findings. "What's the occasion?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral despite the suspicion growing in my chest. "We just closed the biggest deal in company history," Caleb announced triumphantly. "A 3-year contract with Meridian Holdings that's worth $2.8 million. It's exactly the kind of enterprise client that validates our expansion strategy. I thought we could celebrate at Gibson's. My treat, of course." Gibson's Steakhouse was one of Chicago's most expensive restaurants, the kind of place where dinner for two could easily cost $500. The fact that Caleb was suggesting it as a celebration venue, combined with his timing in scheduling this good news meeting right before our planned confrontation, felt like a carefully orchestrated attempt to put me in a positive frame of mind before I could raise uncomfortable questions. But there was something else that bothered me about his announcement. Meridian Holdings wasn't a name I recognized from any of our board discussions about target customers or sales prospects. For a deal of that magnitude, I would have expected Caleb to mention the opportunity during our previous meetings, especially given how aggressively he'd been pushing for expansion funding. "That's wonderful news," I replied, though my enthusiasm was forced. "But let's stick with Friday afternoon as planned. I have some specific financial matters to discuss that can't wait, and I think a restaurant setting might not be appropriate for the conversation I need to have." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Caleb spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly. "What kind of financial matters? Is there a problem with our quarterly reporting?" "We'll discuss everything on Friday," I said firmly. "But Caleb, I need you to understand that this is a serious conversation about the company's financial practices and your role as CEO. Please plan to have the entire afternoon available." After hanging up, I immediately called Patricia Meadows to ask if she could verify the Meridian Holdings contract that Caleb had mentioned. If Wright Technologies had indeed closed a $2.8 million deal, it would significantly change the company's financial picture and potentially complicate the confrontation I was planning. Patricia's research, completed within hours, revealed another layer to Caleb's deception. Meridian Holdings was a real company, but their supposed contract with Wright Technologies was entirely fictional. Patricia's contact at Meridian confirmed that they had never entered into any agreement with Wright Technologies, had never even heard of the company, and had no current need for the type of software solutions that Wright Technologies provided. The fake contract revelation was perhaps more disturbing than the expense manipulation, because it suggested that Caleb was now willing to fabricate major business developments to manipulate my perception of the company's performance. This wasn't just poor judgment about appropriate spending. It was systematic dishonesty designed to prevent oversight of his activities. Thursday evening, I received another call from Caleb, this one with a different energy entirely. His earlier enthusiasm had been replaced by something that sounded almost desperate. "Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation tomorrow, and I want you to know that I really value your input on the company's direction. I know I haven't always been as receptive to your suggestions as I should have been, and I want to do better going forward." The sudden shift to contrition felt as calculated as his previous excitement. "I appreciate that, Caleb. We'll have a thorough discussion tomorrow about how we can improve communication and oversight." "Actually," he continued, I was wondering if we could include Kinsley in part of our meeting. She's been working on some strategic analysis that I think you'd find valuable, and it might help you understand some of the consulting work we've been doing. The mention of Kinsley's name confirmed my suspicion that Caleb knew I was aware of at least some aspects of his financial misconduct. He was attempting to get ahead of my questions by controlling the narrative around her involvement with the company. "No," I said definitively. "This meeting will be between you and me, with Frederick Scott present as CFO. We'll be discussing confidential board matters that aren't appropriate for outside consultants to attend." "Kinsley isn't an outside consultant," Caleb protested. "She's been integral to our business development efforts. Her insights have been invaluable." "We'll discuss her role and compensation tomorrow," I replied, "along with several other financial matters that require clarification." The silence that followed was telling. Caleb was clearly processing the implications of my response, trying to determine how much I knew and how prepared he needed to be for our confrontation. "Mom," he said finally, his voice taking on a pleading quality that reminded me of his teenage years when he'd been caught in some minor transgression. "I hope you're not planning to make any hasty decisions based on incomplete information. The company is doing really well, and I'd hate for misunderstandings to damage what we've built together." That phrase, "what we've built together," crystallized everything that was wrong with how Caleb had come to view our business relationship. In his mind, he was the architect of Wright Technologies' success, while I was merely a financial contributor whose ongoing involvement was optional. The idea that he might be accountable to me as the majority shareholder, or that his decisions might have consequences beyond his own career ambitions, seemed to have been completely abandoned. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of Chicago weather that matched my mood as I prepared for what I knew would be one of the most difficult conversations of my life. I dressed carefully, professional attire that would remind Caleb that this was a business meeting between a majority shareholder and a CEO, not a casual family discussion. Patricia's forensic report was organized in a leather portfolio, with copies prepared for Frederick Scott and our attorney, who would be available by phone if legal questions arose during the meeting. I had also prepared a formal agenda that outlined the specific issues we needed to address: the consulting payments to strategic innovation partners, the personal expenses disguised as business costs, the misleading financial reports, and the fabricated Meridian Holdings contract. As I drove to Wright Technologies' offices that Friday afternoon, I found myself thinking about the conversation Caleb and I had shared 3 years earlier when he first pitched me his vision for the company. The young man who had valued my opinion and sought my guidance seemed like a stranger now, replaced by someone who viewed my involvement as an impediment to his ambitions rather than a partnership based on mutual respect. The parking garage beneath Wright Technologies building felt unusually quiet as I made my way to the elevator. The company's offices were on the 14th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that normally provided a stunning view of Lake Michigan. But as the elevator climbed toward what I suspected would be a confrontation that would change everything between Caleb and me, I found myself focusing not on the view ahead, but on the difficult conversation that awaited. Frederick Scott was already in the conference room when I arrived, his expression grave as he reviewed his own copies of the financial documentation. "Are you ready for this?" he asked as I set down my portfolio and took a seat at the head of the table. "As ready as I can be," I replied, though the truth was that no amount of preparation could have made me ready to confront my son with evidence of systematic fraud and deception. Let's see if he chooses honesty or continues down the path he's been following. At exactly 2 p.m., Caleb walked into the conference room with the kind of confident stride that had once made me proud of his leadership presence. But now, knowing what I knew about his recent activities, that confidence felt like arrogance, and his smile seemed more like a mask than a genuine expression of warmth. "Afternoon, Mom. Frederick," he said, taking his usual seat across from me. "What's on our agenda today?" I opened the leather portfolio in front of me and withdrew Patricia's forensic report, placing it on the table between us. The weight of those pages felt disproportionate to their actual mass. This document contained evidence that would either prompt my son to acknowledge his mistakes and seek redemption, or force me to take actions that would fundamentally alter both our family and his career. "Caleb," I began, my voice steady despite the emotional turmoil beneath the surface, "we need to discuss some serious concerns about Wright Technologies' financial management and your leadership decisions over the past year." His expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the confident smile faltering for just a moment before being reinforced with what seemed like deliberate effort. "Of course, I'm always open to discussing how we can improve our operations. Let's start with Strategic Innovation Partners," I said, turning to the first section of Patricia's report. "Can you explain to me what services they've been providing to justify $300,000 in consulting fees over the past 10 months? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Caleb's eyes darted to Frederick, then back to me, clearly calculating. His response: "Strategic Innovation Partners has been instrumental in our market expansion efforts. They've provided competitive analysis, customer research, and strategic positioning guidance that's been crucial to our growth." "I see," I replied, flipping to the next page of the report. "And can you explain why the principal of strategic innovation partners is Kinsley King, who you've never mentioned in any of our board meetings or family conversations?" This time, the falter in his composure was more visible. His jaw tightened slightly, and I could see him processing the implications of how much I knew. "Kinsley is someone I've been working with professionally. I didn't think her personal relationship with me was relevant to board discussions." "Her personal relationship with you?" I repeated, letting the words settle. "Caleb, are you telling me that Wright Technologies has paid $300,000 to a consulting company owned by your girlfriend, and you saw no conflict of interest worth disclosing to your investors?" Frederick shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly witnessing a confrontation that was more intense than he'd anticipated. Caleb's response came with an edge of defensiveness that was becoming familiar. "The work Kinsley has done has been legitimate and valuable. Her background in marketing and public relations brings expertise that our internal team doesn't have. Then you won't have any problem providing documentation of the specific deliverables and work products that justify these payments," I said, moving to the next exhibit in Patricia's report. "Because according to this forensic analysis, the only documentation associated with these fees are a few generic PowerPoint presentations that appear to have been compiled from publicly available sources. The word forensic hit Caleb like a physical blow. His eyes widened slightly, and for the first time since the meeting began, his carefully constructed composure showed genuine cracks. "You hired a forensic accountant to investigate me?" His voice carried a mixture of disbelief and indignation. That's incredibly insulting, Mom. I can't believe you'd go behind my back like that instead of just asking me directly about any concerns." "I did ask you directly," I reminded him, "multiple times over the past several months. Your responses were evasive, dismissive, or simply false. The Meridian Holdings contract you claim to have closed, for example, Patricia confirmed that no such agreement exists." The color drained from Caleb's face as he realized how thoroughly his deceptions had been uncovered. But instead of acknowledging the lie, he doubled down with an explanation that revealed just how far he'd traveled from the honest young man I'd raised. "That deal is still being finalized," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "There are confidentiality issues that prevented me from sharing details, but the framework is solid." "Caleb," I said, my patience finally beginning to fray, "Meridian Holdings has never heard of Wright Technologies. They confirmed that no negotiations, discussions, or agreements of any kind have taken place. You fabricated that contract completely." The silence that followed was deafening. Frederick stared at his hands, clearly wishing he could be anywhere else. Caleb's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. Finally, he seemed to find his voice, though what emerged was anger rather than contrition. "This is unbelievable," he said, his tone shifting from defensive to accusatory. "You hired investigators to spy on me. You're questioning every business decision I make, and now you're attacking me based on technicalities and misunderstandings." "Misunderstandings?" I repeated, flipping to another section of the report. "What? About the $75,000 BMW that was categorized as executive transportation equipment? Or the $25,000 watch listed as presentation equipment? Are those misunderstandings too?" Each revelation seemed to hit Caleb like another blow, but instead of breaking down his defenses, they seemed to be hardening his resistance. "Those are legitimate business expenses," he insisted. "Image matters in this industry. Clients expect their technology partners to project success and professionalism." "And the weekend in Napa Valley with Kinsley that was billed as a strategic planning retreat?" I pressed. "The $12,000 dinner at Alinea with no business guests present? The designer clothing purchases justified as client-facing attire?" "You're twisting everything," Caleb shot back, his voice rising slightly. "Every successful CEO makes investments in their professional image. You're looking at this like an accountant, instead of understanding how business development actually works." The dismissiveness in his tone, the implication that my decades of venture capital experience made me somehow less qualified to understand business development, triggered something that I'd been suppressing throughout the entire conversation. "How business development works," I said, my voice taking on an edge that made Frederick look up from his papers. "Caleb, I've been evaluating business development strategies for longer than you've been alive. What you're describing isn't business development, it's theft." The word hung in the air between us like a line that once crossed couldn't be uncrossed. Caleb's face flushed with anger, and when he responded, it was with a venom that I'd never heard from him before. "Theft? You want to talk about theft, Mom? What about the way you've been holding your majority ownership over my head like a threat? What about the way you undermine my authority in every board meeting with your constant questioning and second-guessing?" "My questioning and second-guessing have apparently uncovered systematic fraud," I replied, struggling to keep my voice level. "If that undermines your authority, perhaps the problem isn't with my oversight, it's with your actions." "This is exactly what I'm talking about," Caleb said, standing abruptly and beginning to pace around the conference room. "You can't stand that I've built something successful without needing your constant guidance. You invested in this company, but that doesn't give you the right to micromanage every decision I make." The irony of his statement, claiming he'd built something successful while sitting in a meeting about his systematic misappropriation of company funds, seemed to be completely lost on him. But what struck me most was the complete absence of any acknowledgement that he'd done anything wrong. No remorse, no apology, no recognition that his actions had violated the trust I'd placed in him. "Caleb," I said, rising from my own chair to face him directly, "you've stolen money from this company. You've lied to investors, auditors, and board members. You've fabricated contracts and manipulated financial reports. And your response is to blame me for discovering it?" "I haven't stolen anything," he replied, his voice now openly hostile. "I've made strategic investments in building this company's reputation and market position. The fact that you can't see the value in those investments doesn't make them theft. That's..." When he said the words that shattered whatever remained of our professional relationship and fundamentally altered our personal one. "You know what your real problem is, Mom. You're nothing but a burden, always interfering, always questioning my decisions. I'm running a multi-million-dollar company here, not some garage sale. Maybe it's time you accepted that I don't need you, breathing down my neck every month like I'm some kind of project." The conference room fell silent except for the distant hum of traffic 14 floors below. Frederick looked as shocked as I felt, clearly recognizing that we'd crossed a point of no return. But what struck me most wasn't just the cruelty of Caleb's words. It was the complete lack of recognition of what I'd sacrificed to make his company possible. After a long moment, I sat back down and closed Patricia's report. When I spoke, my voice was calmer than I'd expected. "I see," I said quietly. "Well, if that's how you feel about my involvement, then perhaps it's time I reminded you exactly who owns this company and what that means for your future here." The transformation in Caleb's demeanor was immediate and striking. The angry defiance that had characterized his responses throughout our confrontation suddenly gave way to something that looked remarkably like panic. His eyes darted between Frederick and me, as if searching for some indication that my threat wasn't serious. "Mom, wait," he said, his voice losing its hostile edge and taking on a placating tone. "I didn't mean what I just said. I'm under a lot of stress, and I let my emotions get the better of me. Can we please take a step back and discuss this rationally?" But the damage had been done. The word burden had crystallized everything that was wrong with how our relationship had evolved, and his immediate attempt to retract it only confirmed that he understood the implications of what he'd revealed about his true feelings. "No, Caleb," I replied, opening my phone and scrolling to the contact information for our corporate attorney. "I think you meant exactly what you said. And I think it's time we address the governance structure of this company in a way that reflects the reality of our ownership arrangement." Frederick cleared his throat nervously. "Amara, perhaps we should schedule a separate meeting to discuss any potential governance changes. This is a highly emotional situation, and major corporate decisions probably shouldn't be made in the heat of the moment." I appreciated Frederick's attempt at diplomacy, but my decision wasn't driven by emotion. It was driven by the clear evidence of financial misconduct and Caleb's complete lack of accountability for his actions. "Frederick, as the majority shareholder, I'm calling an emergency board meeting for Monday morning at 9 a.m. Please notify Lemuel Kelly that his attendance is required." "An emergency board meeting?" Caleb repeated, the panic in his voice becoming more obvious. "What exactly are you planning to discuss?" I looked at my son. This stranger who had stolen from the company I'd funded, lied to the investors who trusted him, and then had the audacity to call me a burden for discovering his misconduct, and felt a clarity I hadn't experienced in months. "I'm going to propose a vote of no confidence in your leadership as CEO," I said simply. "The evidence of financial mismanagement and fraudulent activity that we've discussed today will be presented to the full board, and they'll have the opportunity to decide whether Wright Technologies needs new leadership." The color drained from Caleb's face completely. "You can't be serious. This is my company. I built this from nothing." "You built it with $2.3 million of my money," I reminded him. "And according to Patricia's forensic analysis, you've misappropriated over $200,000 of that investment for personal expenses while providing fraudulent reports to conceal your activities." Caleb stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward and hitting the credenza behind him. "This is insane. You're going to destroy everything we've worked for because of some accounting disagreements?" "Accounting disagreements?" Frederick interjected, speaking up for the first time since the confrontation had escalated. "Caleb, these aren't disagreements about categorization. These are systematic violations of fiduciary duty and potentially criminal fraud. The fact that Frederick, who had been hesitant to criticize Caleb throughout this entire process, was now openly supporting my position, seemed to hit Caleb like another blow. He turned to face our CFO with a mixture of betrayal and desperation. "Frederick, you know how hard I've worked to build this company. Are you really going to side with her over some expense classification issues?" "I'm not siding with anyone," Frederick replied, though his tone made it clear where his loyalties lay. "I'm supporting accurate financial reporting and proper corporate governance. What you've described as expense classification issues are actually falsified invoices and misrepresented expenditures that violate both our fiduciary duties to investors and our obligations to auditors." I could see Caleb processing the implications of Frederick's response. Without the CFO's support, any attempt to challenge my authority would be significantly more difficult. His next move was predictable, but still disappointing. An appeal to emotion and family loyalty that completely ignored the substantive issues we'd been discussing. "Mom, please," he said, turning back to me with an expression that was meant to evoke the little boy who used to seek comfort after a nightmare. "Don't destroy our relationship over business disagreements. We can work through this together, the way we always have." "The way we always have?" I repeated, genuinely incredulous at his characterization of our recent interactions. "Caleb, when was the last time you genuinely sought my input on a significant business decision? When was the last time you treated me with the respect due to a major investor, let alone your mother?" He was quiet for a moment, clearly recognizing that honesty wouldn't serve his purposes. When he spoke again, it was with the kind of calculated manipulation that had become his default mode of communication. "I know I haven't been as collaborative as I should have been," he admitted. "But that's something we can fix going forward. If you give me another chance, I promise to be more transparent and to value your input the way I should have all along." The promise felt hollow, partly because it came only after he'd been caught in systematic deception, but mainly because it still didn't include any acknowledgement that he'd done anything wrong. In Caleb's version of events, the problem was his failure to communicate better, not his decision to steal money and lie about it. "What about the money you've misappropriated?" I asked. "What about the fraudulent reports you've provided to auditors? What about the shell company payments to your girlfriend? Are those also just communication issues that we can fix going forward?" Caleb's face flushed again, and I could see him struggling between continuing his denials and acknowledging reality. "Those situations are more complicated than they appear on paper. If you give me time to explain the full context, I think you'll understand that my decisions were in the company's best interests." "I've given you the entire afternoon to provide that context," I pointed out. "Your explanations have consisted of denying documented facts and blaming me for discovering them." That's when Caleb made what turned out to be a critical tactical error. Instead of continuing to apologize and seek reconciliation, he reverted to the aggressive posture that had characterized much of our recent relationship. "Fine," he said, crossing his arms and adopting a defiant stance. "If you want to have this fight, we'll have it. But don't think you can just walk in here and take over my company because you wrote a check 3 years ago. I have rights as CEO, and I have relationships with employees and customers that you can't just replace." The shift back to hostility revealed something important about Caleb's mindset. He genuinely believed that his role as founder and CEO gave him some kind of immunity from investor oversight, even when that oversight had uncovered clear evidence of financial misconduct. He seemed to view my 51% ownership stake as a technicality, rather than the legal reality that gave me ultimate authority over company decisions. "You're absolutely right that you have relationships with employees and customers," I agreed. "Which is why the board will have the opportunity to consider whether maintaining those relationships requires keeping you in a leadership role, or whether protecting the company's integrity requires making a change." "The board?" Caleb laughed, though there was no humor in it. "You mean Frederick, who's clearly already made up his mind, and Lemuel, who barely understands our business model? That's not a board. It's a kangaroo court." Frederick's expression hardened at Caleb's dismissive characterization of the board structure. "Caleb, I've supported your leadership for 3 years, even when I had concerns about certain decisions. But the evidence Amara has presented today goes far beyond differences of opinion about business strategy. Evidence that she obtained by spying on me behind my back," Caleb shot back. "Evidence that was compiled by investigators whose job was to make me look bad. Evidence that was necessary because you've been providing false information to investors and auditors," I corrected. "Patricia's investigation simply documented what you've been doing. She didn't fabricate the payments to Kinsley's company or the personal expenses you've disguised as business costs." We were clearly at an impasse. Caleb was either unwilling or unable to acknowledge the seriousness of his actions, and his continued attempts to deflect responsibility onto me or others only reinforced my belief that a change in leadership was necessary. I gathered the papers from Patricia's report and stood up from the conference table. The emergency board meeting will be held Monday morning at 9 a.m. in this conference room. Frederick will send you the formal notice along with copies of the forensic accounting report that will be presented for the board's consideration. Mom, please, Caleb said one final time, his voice taking on a desperate quality. Don't do this. We can find a way to work through our differences without destroying everything. I paused at the conference room door and looked back at him. For just a moment, I saw a glimpse of the young man who had once called me with exciting ideas and valued my guidance. But that person had been replaced by someone who viewed accountability as an attack and oversight as betrayal. Caleb, I said softly, the only thing being destroyed here is the illusion that you can misappropriate investor funds without consequences. If you're truly committed to preserving what we've built together, you'll use the weekend to prepare an honest accounting of your actions and a genuine plan for making things right. As I walked toward the elevator, I could hear Caleb's voice behind me, though I couldn't make out the words. Whatever he was saying to Frederick, it was too late to change the course we were now on. The die had been cast, and come Monday morning, Wright Technologies would have a new leadership structure, with or without Caleb's cooperation. The weekend that followed our confrontation was a whirlwind of phone calls, legal consultations, and soul-searching that left me emotionally exhausted but resolute in my decision. Saturday morning brought the first surprise. A call from David Chen, one of Wright Technologies' co-founders, requesting an urgent meeting. Mrs. Wright, David said when I answered, his voice carrying an unusual tension. I hope you don't mind me calling you directly, but I've heard about Monday's board meeting, and there are some things I think you need to know before you make any final decisions about Caleb's leadership. We met at a quiet coffee shop in Lincoln Park, far from Wright Technologies' offices and the inevitable office politics that might influence our conversation. David arrived looking haggard, as if he'd spent the entire weekend wrestling with a difficult decision. I want to be clear from the start, he began, stirring his coffee nervously, that I've been loyal to Caleb since college, and I genuinely believe in the technology we've built together. But what's been happening over the past year has made me increasingly uncomfortable. Over the next 2 hours, David revealed details that made Patricia's forensic investigation seem conservative by comparison. The misappropriation of funds that we'd documented was apparently just the tip of the iceberg. David had been excluded from major financial decisions, told that certain expenditures were board-approved when no such approval had been given, and pressured to provide technical justifications for consulting contracts that he'd never seen or understood. The strategic innovation partner situation is worse than you probably know, David explained, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Kinsley has been involved in operational decisions that go far beyond marketing consulting. She's been sitting in on technical development meetings, influencing product roadmap decisions, and essentially acting as an unofficial co-CEO without any formal authority or accountability. This revelation was particularly disturbing because it suggested that Caleb's financial misconduct was accompanied by operational dysfunction that could threaten the company's core competencies. Having an unqualified person influence technical decisions was potentially more damaging than the financial irregularities we'd already uncovered. Why haven't you spoken up before now? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. David's expression was pained. Because Caleb is my friend, and I kept hoping he'd come to his senses. But after Friday's confrontation, Frederick told me some of what happened. I realized that staying silent was hurting the company and all the employees who depend on it. The conversation took an even more serious turn when David revealed that several key employees were aware of the company's problems and had been quietly exploring other job opportunities. The technical team that formed the backbone of Wright Technologies was beginning to fracture, not because of external market forces, but because of internal leadership failures. Aaliyah has already received 2 job offers from competitors, David admitted. She's been holding off on accepting them because she believes in our platform, but she's losing confidence in Caleb's ability to lead the company effectively. Sunday brought another unexpected development. A call from Lemuel Kelly, our independent board member, who had spent his weekend reviewing the materials Frederick had sent in preparation for Monday's meeting. "Amara," Lemuel said without preamble, "I've been serving on corporate boards for 15 years, and I've never seen a more clear-cut case for leadership change. The evidence you've compiled isn't just concerning, it's damning." Lemuel's legal background gave weight to his assessment. As a former corporate attorney who now served on several tech company boards, his evaluation carried the kind of professional credibility that would be crucial in justifying whatever decisions we made. "What's your recommendation for Monday's meeting?" I asked. "Immediate removal," he replied without hesitation. The financial misconduct alone would justify that action, but the operational dysfunction that David described makes it urgent. Every day that Caleb remains as CEO increases the risk of further damage to the company. Monday morning arrived with unseasonably warm weather for Chicago in March, but the atmosphere inside Wright Technologies' conference room was decidedly chilly. Caleb arrived precisely at 9 a.m., accompanied by an attorney I didn't recognize. A middle-aged woman in an expensive suit who introduced herself as Sarah Martinez from Clark & Associates. "Mrs. Wright," Sarah said as she arranged legal documents on the table, "my client has asked me to be present during today's proceedings to ensure that his rights as founder and CEO are properly protected." The presence of legal counsel confirmed that Caleb was prepared to fight rather than seek reconciliation. But it also suggested that he still didn't fully understand the gravity of his situation. As the majority shareholder, I had the legal authority to remove him regardless of his founder status or personal preferences. "Of course," I replied cordially, "though I should mention that this is a board meeting of Wright Technologies, and your client's rights are defined by corporate governance documents and Delaware corporate law, not by his role as founder." Frederick began the meeting by presenting a summary of the forensic accounting findings, walking through each category of misconduct with the methodical precision that had made him an effective CFO. The shell company payments, the personal expenses, the falsified invoices, the fabricated contracts. Each revelation was more damaging than the last. Caleb's attorney took notes throughout Frederick's presentation, occasionally whispering questions to her client. But as the evidence mounted, even her professional composure began to show cracks. It was clear that either Caleb hadn't fully briefed her on the scope of the misconduct, or she hadn't expected the documentation to be as comprehensive as Patricia's investigation had made it. "Mr. Wright," Lemuel said when Frederick finished his presentation, "do you dispute any of the factual findings that have been presented?" Caleb looked to his attorney, who nodded slightly before he responded. "We dispute the characterization of certain expenditures as inappropriate, and we maintain that all business decisions were made in good faith with the company's best interests in mind." It was a carefully worded non-denial that acknowledged the facts while disputing their interpretation. But in the context of a board meeting focused on fiduciary responsibility, the distinction was meaningless. "The question before this board," I said, addressing my comments to Frederick and Lemuel rather than Caleb, "is whether the documented pattern of financial misconduct and operational dysfunction is compatible with continued leadership of Wright Technologies." I call for a formal vote of no confidence in Caleb Wright's leadership as Chief Executive Officer, Lemuel said, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority. "Seconded," Frederick added immediately. The vote itself was anticlimactic. So, my 51% ownership stake, the outcome was predetermined regardless of how the others voted. But the unanimous support from Frederick and Lemuel provided the kind of legitimacy that would be important for employee morale and external relationships. "The motion passes," I announced. Effective immediately, Caleb Wright is removed from his position as Chief Executive Officer of Wright Technologies. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Caleb's attorney shuffling papers. When Caleb finally spoke, his voice was hollow with disbelief. "You can't do this to me. This is my life's work." "Your life's work will continue," I replied, though not without sympathy for the pain he was experiencing. The technology you helped develop, the team you helped assemble, the customers you helped serve, all of that will continue under new leadership. What new leadership? He asked, the reality of his situation apparently beginning to sink in. David, Chen will serve as interim CEO while we conduct a search for permanent leadership, I announced, having made this decision over the weekend after my conversation with David. Frederick will continue as CFO, and Lemuel will chair a leadership transition committee. The meeting concluded with discussions of practical matters, access to company systems, communication with employees, transition of responsibilities. Caleb said little during these discussions, occasionally conferring with his attorney, but mostly staring at the table in front of him. As the formal proceedings ended and others began to leave, Caleb finally looked up at me with an expression that mixed hurt, anger, and something that might have been recognition of the consequences his actions had created. "Was this really worth it, Mom?" he asked quietly. "Destroying our relationship to prove a point about corporate governance?" I considered his question carefully before responding. "Caleb, I didn't destroy our relationship. Your choices did that. What happened here today was about protecting a company and its employees from leadership that had lost its way." As I gathered my papers and prepared to leave the conference room where I had just fundamentally altered my son's life, I felt not triumph, but a profound sadness for what had been lost, and a cautious hope for what might still be saved. 6 months after that devastating Monday morning board meeting, I found myself standing in the same Wright Technologies conference room, but the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. David Chen was presenting quarterly results to a room full of engaged employees, and the energy was palpable, focused, optimistic, and genuinely collaborative in a way that had been missing during Caleb's final months as CEO. "Revenue is up 67% from the same quarter last year," David announced, clicking through slides that showed steady growth across all key metrics. "Customer retention has improved to 94%, and we've successfully launched 2 new product modules ahead of schedule." The turnaround had been remarkable to witness. Under David's leadership, Wright Technologies had not only stabilized, but thrived in ways that validated my painful decision to remove Caleb from leadership. The company culture had transformed from one of secrecy and dysfunction to transparency and accountability. Financial reporting was now comprehensive and accurate. Strategic decisions were made collaboratively, and employee morale had reached levels that surpassed even the early startup days. Aaliyah Cooper, who had been considering job offers from competitors, was now serving as Chief Technology Officer and had become one of David's most trusted advisors. The technical team that had been fragmenting under Caleb's erratic leadership was now cohesive and productive, delivering innovations that were genuinely advancing the company's mission. The platform stability improvements we implemented in Q2 have reduced customer support requests by 40%, Aaliyah reported during her portion of the presentation. And the user interface redesign has decreased onboarding time for new clients by an average of 3 days. These weren't just impressive numbers. They represented the kind of operational excellence that had been missing during the period when Caleb was more focused on expensive dinners and luxury purchases than on building sustainable value for customers. Perhaps, most significantly, Wright Technologies had attracted legitimate outside investment for the first time since my initial funding. A respected venture capital firm had recently committed $5 million to support the company's expansion plans, valuing the business at $18 million, a figure that represented substantial appreciation from my original investment 3 years earlier. The investors were particularly impressed by our governance structure and financial transparency, Frederick Scott noted as he reviewed the investment terms. They mentioned that the quality of our reporting and oversight processes exceeded what they typically see from companies our size. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very oversight and accountability that Caleb had found so burdensome had become Wright Technologies' greatest asset in attracting professional investors who understood, The value of proper corporate governance. But the success of the company was only part of the story that had unfolded over these 6 months. The personal dimension, my relationship with Caleb, had followed a more complex and painful trajectory that was still evolving. The immediate aftermath of his removal had been ugly. Caleb had initially threatened legal action, claiming that my decision was based on personal animosity rather than legitimate business concerns. His attorney had sent several demand letters seeking reinstatement and financial compensation, but these efforts had quickly collapsed when faced with the comprehensive evidence of financial misconduct that Patricia's investigation had uncovered. More personally damaging were Caleb's attempts to salvage his reputation by portraying himself as the victim of an overbearing mother who couldn't accept her son's independence. He had given interviews to several business publications, painting a picture of family dysfunction that cast me as a controlling investor who had sabotaged his success out of spite. The narrative had briefly gained traction in certain circles, particularly among younger entrepreneurs who saw parallels to their own struggles with investor oversight. But as more details about the financial misconduct emerged, particularly the revelation about the shell company payments to his girlfriend, public opinion had shifted decisively against Caleb's version of events. Kinsley King had disappeared from his life almost immediately after the board meeting, apparently having no interest in a relationship that no longer provided access to company funds. The Strategic Innovation Partners consulting firm had been quietly dissolved, and Kinsley had moved to Los Angeles to pursue what she described as new opportunities in the entertainment industry. For several months, Caleb had struggled to find his footing professionally. The technology industry was small enough that news of his removal from Wright Technologies had spread quickly, making it difficult for him to secure leadership positions with other companies. The combination of documented financial misconduct and his public attempts to blame others for his failures had created a reputation that most employers found problematic. But then something had begun to shift. About 4 months after his removal, Caleb had reached out to me through Frederick, requesting a private conversation. When we met, at a neutral location far from Wright Technologies' offices, he was a different person than the defensive, hostile young man I'd confronted in that conference room. "Mom," he'd said, his voice quiet and stripped of the arrogance that had characterized our previous interactions. "I need to apologize to you, and I need to try to explain what happened to me over the past year." What followed was the most honest conversation we'd had in years. Caleb acknowledged that the success of Wright Technologies had gone to his head in ways that had distorted his judgment and his values. The attention from business media, the respect from customers, and the lifestyle that investor funding had made possible had gradually convinced him that normal rules didn't apply to him. "I started believing my own press," he admitted. "I thought that because the company was growing and customers were happy, the way I was spending money didn't really matter. And when you started asking questions, I felt like you didn't trust me or believe in my capabilities." More significantly, he had begun to understand how Kinsley's influence had contributed to his poor decisions. What he'd initially seen as supportive partnership had actually been manipulation designed to benefit her financially, while isolating him from the people who genuinely cared about his success. "She convinced me that your oversight was abnormal, that other CEOs didn't have to deal with that kind of investor involvement," Caleb explained. "She made me feel like I was being treated like a child instead of a professional, and that resentment made me defensive about everything you said." This conversation had been emotionally difficult for both of us, but it had also marked the beginning of a slow healing process. Caleb had started therapy to address the entitlement and poor judgment that had led to his downfall, and he'd begun working with a career counselor to rebuild his professional reputation in a more sustainable way. 3 months ago, he'd accepted a senior developer position with a mid-sized software company in Milwaukee, a significant step down from CEO of his own company, but an opportunity to prove himself again in an environment with proper oversight and accountability. His new role focused on the technical work he genuinely excelled at, without the management and financial responsibilities that had proven to be his weakness. "I'm actually happier than I've been in years," he'd told me during our most recent conversation. "The work is challenging, my colleagues respect my contributions, and I don't have to worry about board meetings or investor relations. I can focus on what I'm actually good at." The relationship between us was still fragile, and would probably always carry scars from the betrayal and confrontation we'd experienced. But it was honest in a way that it hadn't been during his final months at Wright Technologies, built on a realistic understanding of both our strengths and our limitations. "I understand now why you had to remove me," he'd said during that recent call. "I was destroying the company and myself, and I was too arrogant to see it. You saved Wright Technologies. And you probably saved me too, even though it took me months to recognize it." As I looked around the Wright Technologies conference room that day, watching David present results that exceeded even our most optimistic projections, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: pride in what the company had become under proper leadership, satisfaction that my difficult decision had been vindicated by subsequent events, sadness for the relationship with Caleb that had been damaged, but hope for the healing that was slowly taking place. The young man I'd invested in 3 years earlier had possessed genuine talent and vision, but success had corrupted his judgment in ways that made continued leadership impossible. The person he was becoming now, humbled by failure, committed to personal growth, focused on contribution rather than control, might actually be closer to the son I'd raised than the CEO he'd briefly been. When people ask me whether I regret the decision to remove my own son from the company we'd built together, my answer is always the same. I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret doing what was right for the company, its employees, and ultimately for Caleb himself. Sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is set boundaries that prevent further self-destruction, even when those boundaries feel like betrayal to the person who needs them most. Sometimes protecting someone means protecting them from themselves, even at the cost of immediate relationship damage. Wright Technologies continued to thrive, its mission of democratizing business technology more alive than ever under leadership that understood the difference between vision and ego. And Caleb was slowly rebuilding his life and career on a foundation of humility and accountability that would serve him far better than the arrogance and entitlement that had previously driven his ambitions. The story wasn't over for the company, for our family, or for Caleb personally, but it had evolved from a tale of betrayal and consequences into something more hopeful, a story about the possibility of redemption, the importance of accountability, and the complex but enduring nature of love between family members who sometimes have to choose doing what's right over doing what's easy. In the end, that's what real leadership looks like, whether in business or in parenting. Sometimes it means making decisions that hurt in the short term, but protect what matters most in the long term. Sometimes it means being the burden that prevents someone from carrying a weight that would ultimately crush them. And sometimes, if you're very fortunate, it means watching someone you love find their way back to the person you always knew they could become. The invitation arrived on elegant cream-colored paper, hand-addressed in Caleb's careful script. Wright Technologies cordially invites you to celebrate our acquisition by Meridian Holdings Corporation, it read. The irony of the company name wasn't lost on me. The same Meridian Holdings that Caleb had once falsely claimed as a client was now genuinely acquiring the company he'd been forced to leave. As I entered the celebratory reception at Chicago's Museum of Contemporary Art, I was struck by how much had changed since that devastating confrontation 2 years earlier. The room buzzed with conversation between Wright Technologies employees, Meridian executives, and investors, all celebrating a transaction that valued the company at $47 million, more than double the valuation from our previous funding round. David. Chen spotted me near the entrance and approached with the warm smile that had made him such an effective leader. Amara, I'm so glad you could make it. None of this would have been possible without your courage to make the hard decisions when they were needed. The acquisition had been the culmination of 18 months of exceptional growth under David's leadership. Wright Technologies had expanded into new markets, developed innovative features that set them apart from competitors, and built a reputation for reliability and customer service that made them an attractive target for larger companies seeking to expand their software portfolios. How are the employees feeling about the transition? I asked, watching familiar faces throughout the room. Excited, David replied enthusiastically. Meridian is committed to maintaining our team and culture while providing the resources to scale much faster than we could on our own. Aaliyah will be leading a new division focused on small business solutions, and Frederick is being promoted to VP of Finance for Meridian's entire software portfolio. As we talked, I noticed Caleb across the room, engaged in animated conversation with several Meridian executives. He looked different, more relaxed than I'd seen him in years, wearing a simple business suit rather than the expensive designer clothes that had once seemed so important to him. When our eyes met, he smiled and began making his way over. "Mom," he said, embracing me with genuine warmth. "Thank you for coming tonight. I know this must be a complex evening for you." It was indeed complex. Pride in the company's success mixed with satisfaction that my difficult decision had been vindicated, tinged with lingering sadness about the path that had brought us to this point. But predominantly, I felt grateful for the healing that had taken place between us, for the lessons we'd both learned, and for the opportunity to witness redemption in action. "How does it feel to be back here?" I asked, genuinely curious about his emotional state. Caleb considered the question thoughtfully. "Humbling," he said finally. "David invited me to consult on the acquisition because I helped develop some of the core technology, and the Meridian team wanted to understand the original architecture. It's strange to be talking about something I helped create but no longer own, but it's also liberating." Over the past year, Caleb's career had continued to stabilize and grow. His work in Milwaukee had earned recognition within the company, leading to a promotion and increased responsibilities. More importantly, he'd begun speaking at technology conferences about the lessons he'd learned from his failures, turning his experience into a cautionary tale that helped other young entrepreneurs avoid similar pitfalls. "I got another speaking request this week," he told me. "A startup accelerator in Austin wants me to talk to their summer cohort about corporate governance and the importance of investor relationships. It's ironic that my biggest failure has become my most valuable expertise." The transformation in his perspective was remarkable. The Caleb who had once viewed investor oversight as interference now understood it as protection. The young man who had resented accountability now advocated for transparency. The entrepreneur who had confused luxury spending with business development now counseled fiscal discipline and sustainable growth. As the evening progressed, I found myself in conversation with representatives from Meridian Holdings who were full of praise for Wright Technologies' governance structure and financial practices. They specifically mentioned the quality of board oversight and the thoroughness of financial reporting as factors that had made the acquisition process smooth and transparent. Companies with this level of corporate maturity are rare in the startup ecosystem, one Meridian vice president told me. It made our due diligence process much more straightforward and gave us confidence that we were acquiring a well-managed asset. Later, as the reception began to wind down, Caleb approached me one final time. "Mom, there's something I want to give you," he said, handing me a small wrapped package. Inside was a simple silver picture frame containing a photograph from Wright Technologies' early days. Caleb, David, and Aaliyah in their original shared office space, surrounded by whiteboards covered in technical diagrams and business plans. They looked impossibly young and enthusiastic, full of dreams and ambition that seemed entirely achievable. "I found this while cleaning out some old files," Caleb explained. "I thought you should have it. Not because of what the company became, but because of what it represented when we started, the belief that we could build something meaningful together. The gesture brought tears to my eyes, both for the innocence captured in that photograph and for the wisdom that experience had brought to all of us. "Thank you," I said simply. "I'll treasure it." As I drove home that night, I reflected on the journey that had brought us from that excited phone call 3 years earlier to this celebration of successful exit. The path had been far more complicated and painful than any of us could have anticipated, but it had also taught lessons that extended far beyond business success. I had learned that love sometimes requires setting boundaries that feel like betrayal, that protecting someone's long-term interests might mean accepting short-term damage to your relationship with them, that the most difficult decisions are often the most necessary ones, and that doing what's right isn't always the same as doing what's easy. Caleb had learned that talent and vision without character and accountability are ultimately destructive. That success without humility is fragile and temporary. That the relationships you damage in pursuit of individual achievement are often more valuable than the achievements themselves. And Wright Technologies had proven that companies can survive and thrive through leadership transitions when they're built on solid foundations rather than individual personalities. That proper governance and financial discipline create value rather than constraining it. That transparency and accountability are competitive advantages rather than bureaucratic burdens. 6 months after the acquisition, I received a letter from Caleb that I've kept on my desk as a reminder of how far we've both traveled from that dark period when our relationship seemed irreparably broken. "Dear Mom," it read, "I've been thinking about something you said during one of our recent conversations, that sometimes being a burden means carrying weight, so someone else doesn't have to bear it alone. I understand now that when I called you a burden, I was really angry that you wouldn't let me carry the weight of bad decisions that would have eventually crushed not just me, but everyone who depended on Wright Technologies. You were willing to be seen as the villain so that I could eventually become the person I'm capable of being. That's not a burden. That's love. Thank you for caring enough to carry that weight when I couldn't. With gratitude and love, Caleb." Today, as I write this story, Wright Technologies continues to thrive as part of Meridian Holdings. David Chen has been promoted again and is now leading software development for the entire corporation. Aaliyah Cooper's division has become one of Meridian's fastest-growing business units. Frederick Scott's financial expertise has helped streamline operations across multiple subsidiaries. And Caleb? He's now the Chief Technology Officer at his Milwaukee company, having earned the promotion through consistent performance and genuine leadership development. He's also become a sought-after speaker on topics of entrepreneurship, corporate governance, and learning from failure. His talks consistently receive standing ovations, not because he tells people what they want to hear, but because he shares hard-won wisdom about the price of integrity and the value of accountability. Our relationship has evolved into something stronger than it was before the crisis, built on mutual respect and realistic understanding rather than the idealized assumptions that had previously defined it. We talk regularly, share advice freely, and support each other's endeavors without the undercurrent of resentment that had characterized our interactions during Wright Technologies' troubled period. The story of Wright Technologies serves as a reminder that in both business and family relationships, the most loving thing you can do is sometimes the hardest thing you can do. That accountability and consequences, while painful in the short term, create the foundation for genuine growth and lasting success. And that sometimes, when someone calls you a burden for caring enough to ask difficult questions and demand honest answers, the best response isn't to retreat, it's to prove exactly how much weight you're willing to carry to protect what matters most. The burden of doing what's right, it turns out, is one that leaders in every context must be willing to bear. Whether you're a parent, an investor, a board member, or simply someone who cares about integrity and accountability, there will be moments when you must choose between being liked and being right, between maintaining comfortable illusions and confronting uncomfortable truths. In those moments, I've learned it's better to be the burden that prevents disaster than the enabler who allows it to unfold. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the strength to help them carry the weight of their own accountability, even when they're not yet ready to appreciate that gift. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.